It's great once you understand every single triad that you have in any major key, but then from there, we're still only limited to 7 chords. And of course, if you sort of discount the diminished chord because it's not super useful, we effectively have just 6. So it can be a good thing to talk about how we can spice up the chords that we have. So in this video, we're going to talk about how to spice up a 2 chord. So just as a quick refresher, if you don't know what a 2 chord is, basically here we're talking about a minor 2 chord, which is going to be a chord that is built off of the 2nd scale degree of any major key. So if you are in the key of C major, your 2 chord, your minor 2 chord would be a D minor chord. Or if you are in G major, then your 2 chord would be A minor. So 2 chord is always going to be minor in any major key. So one great way to change up your minor 2 chord is actually to make it a major 2 chord instead, which would be a borrowed chord. Specifically, you'd probably look at this as borrowing from whatever scale you're in instead of major. Instead, it would be Lydian, because the main characteristic that is different between the Lydian mode and a regular major key is going to be that major 2 chord, because overall the only difference between Lydian and major is that a Lydian has a sharp 4. So in the context of C major, we have C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and then back to C, of course. So our 4th scale degree would be 1, 2, 3, 4 would be F. So Lydian would have an F sharp instead of an F natural, which is what's naturally occurring in C major. So C Lydian would have C, D, E, F sharp, and then G, A, B. So if you utilize a major 2 chord instead of a minor 2 chord, you're effectively having that small part of the music go into the Lydian mode. So if you're in E major and you have an F sharp major chord instead of the naturally occurring F sharp minor chord, that would be effectively being in E Lydian. So overall, this major 2 chord can be a great way for a change up because it's slightly surprising in context of the key that you've already established. So if you go C major, F major, G major, and then that major 2 instead of that minor 2, that's going to be a little bit surprising instead of what would be naturally occurring, which would be that minor 2. Just a quick note on utilizing this major 2 is if you want to quickly reestablish, hey, I'm actually in the major key still. Let's take C as an example because we've been using that already. So if you're in C major, but then you use a D major chord, you might want to reestablish, hey, we are still in C major fairly quickly, in which case a great way to do that is then just to use your major 4 chord, where if you have C major and then you have D major, now it's like, this could be in the key of G major. But then once you have that F natural again, now it's reestablishing, no, that was just a momentary change. That was just a borrowed chord. We still are in C major where we have an F natural rather than the F sharp that would be naturally occurring in G major. Another thing you can do to spice up your minor 2 chord is to actually use a suspended chord instead, whether a sus4 or a sus2. Sometimes sus chords can be a great way to make your chord a little bit more vague. So if you take a major chord and instead make it a suspended chord, oftentimes that makes it sound a little bit darker because it's a little more vague. Instead of being like, yes, major, kind of happy sounding, it will get more vague, which usually means that it will have shades of the more sad, melancholy minor sound. Whereas if you take a minor chord and then make it suspended, usually that vagueness allows you to entertain the idea that maybe it's not such a dark chord. So sticking with C major and having our D minor chord, this sound versus this, that probably sounds a little bit brighter to you. And then taking the sus2 instead of the sus4, this does still sound fairly dark, but not quite as obviously dark as that regular old minor 2. Now, I think the reason that the sus2 chord in this case sounds darker than the sus4 chord is because of the inversions of each of these chords. If we take the sus4 chord, this is, yes, a minor 2 sus4 chord, but if we look at it from another point of view, it could be a 5 chord sus2. And unlike a 2 chord, a 5 chord is actually a major chord. So the fact that the inversion of the minor 2, that's a sus4, is actually a sus2 of a major 5 chord, helps to give it that little bit more brightness. On the other hand, the minor 2 sus2 chord, its inversion is actually a minor 6 chord, but sus4. Always a sus2 chord's inversion will be a sus4, and a sus4 chord's inversion will be a sus2, but also will change the chord. So in this case, our minor 2 sus2 chord's inversion is actually a minor 6 chord, sus4. Now, at least to my ears, minor 6 chords tend to sound a little bit less dark than minor 2 chords and minor 3 chords. I'm sure that's somewhat subjective, but I think overall that's a part of the reason why, along with the vagueness, I think a regular minor 2 is probably the darkest, and then maybe the sus2 is a little bit less dark. Right afterwards, it sounds maybe more dark because it's descending in this context, but more or less equal because they're both based around minor chords no matter what the inversion is, because this, again, still a minor chord if you change the inversion. But then when you take that sus4, that's actually an inversion of a major chord, specifically the major 5 chord. So regardless, if you want to give some different shading to your minor 2 chord, specifically if you want to make it a little less dark, I highly recommend using that sus4 chord instead of utilizing either the sus2 or certainly the regular triad of a minor 2 chord. So hopefully this was helpful to you. If it was, something else you'll likely find helpful is my free guide on the 4 pillars of music theory that I think every songwriter really needs to know. This was a little bit deeper on the music theory, but if you didn't really understand what a 2 chord is or a 5 chord, or you've never heard chords referenced that way, this guide is certainly for you, because ultimately, I think the most important way to understand music is not something like, oh, it's a C major chord and a G major chord and a D minor chord. Because, yeah, those are chords, but what's more important and what tells you more about those chords is understanding those chords in context of the keys they're in. So, for example, in the context of G major, a G major chord operates as a 1 chord, which is a totally different job than it would operate in C major, because in the context of C major, a G major chord is actually operating as a 5 chord, which has a totally different job. So even though the chord is the same, G major, what's more important and more indicative of what its job is and how it sounds is actually based on the context of the key. So to me, the 4 pillars of music theory that every songwriter really needs to know is intervals, because everything else is built on top of that, and then chords, chord progressions, and keys. If you understand those things, I think if you know anything about the 80-20 rule, that's basically the 20% that gets you 80% of the results when it comes to music theory, is understanding your keys and understanding your chords and chord progressions in your keys. That way you can move away from just saying things like, oh, C major chords and G major chords sound good together. Like, yeah, that's generally true, but really the underlying reason why you think that's true is usually those 2 chords are happening in context of either C major or G major, where in the context of C major, that's true because that's your 1 chord, C major, and your 5 chord, G major. And in the context of G major, that would actually be your 1 chord, G major, and your 4 chord, C major, because it's built off of the 1, 2, 3, 4th scale degree, your C major chord. So if you're interested in learning the music theory, that is like the 20%, not really even 20%, probably 5% that gets you like 80% of the results with your music writing. Be sure to check that out. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate every single one of you. I'll talk to you in the next one.